For the German High Command, in World War II, one American general became an obsession. More intelligence resources were devoted to tracking him than to almost any other Allied commander. Not Dwight D. Eisenhower, who directed the entire Allied war effort in Europe. Not Bernard Montgomery, the careful and methodical British general. Instead, German officers focused their attention on one man whose presence alone seemed to signal danger. General George S. Patton. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in Western Europe, followed Patton's movements with intense interest. Any report mentioning Patton's location was marked as high-priority intelligence. Rundstedt had faced many capable enemy generals during the war, but Patton was different. Patton frightened him. He represented something unfamiliar in the American army: speed, aggression, and unpredictability. The Germans first encountered Patton in November 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, landing more than 35,000 American troops along the coast of Morocco. This operation marked America's first major ground assault against Axis forces. German intelligence officers watched closely. They always studied enemy commanders, searching for patterns and weaknesses they could exploit. What they saw immediately disturbed them. Patton did not behave like a typical American general. The U.S. Army was known for cautious advances, heavy preparation, and overwhelming firepower. Patton ignored that pattern. He moved fast, much faster than German analysts expected. Within just 3 days of landing, his forces had secured Casablanca and forced the French defenders to surrender. His troops advanced at a pace that caught German observers completely off guard. Reports from the field described an American commander who pressed forward relentlessly, accepting risks that American doctrine usually avoided. Field Marshal Albert Kasserine, commander of German forces in the Mediterranean, requested detailed intelligence on Patton. Who was this general? How did he think? What made him so dangerous? The answers unsettled German leadership. Patton had spent his entire military career studying German warfare. He read German military theory in the original language. He had walked the battlefields of World War I, studying where German offensives had nearly broken through Allied lines. He understood German operational thinking better than many German officers themselves. This meant Patton didn't merely fight the Germans. He anticipated them. In February 1943, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched a devastating offensive at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The attack smashed through inexperienced American units, sending them retreating in confusion. It was the worst defeat suffered by U.S. ground forces during the entire war. German commanders watched closely, curious to see how the Americans would react. Would the Americans withdraw completely? Would they replace their leaders? Would their morale collapse? The answer arrived in early March. George S. Patton took command of the shattered U.S. II Corps. What happened next stunned German intelligence officers monitoring the front. Within 2 weeks, Patton transformed the defeated force. Discipline was restored with ruthless efficiency. Sloppy uniforms disappeared. Commanders were held personally accountable. Training intensified. The same soldiers who had fled in panic were suddenly attacking again. German reconnaissance units reported something new and alarming: aggressive American patrols probing their lines relentlessly. This was not the cautious enemy they had faced before. Rommel himself noticed the change. In his diary, he wrote that American forces had suddenly become far more dangerous. The transformation was too rapid to be explained by reinforcements or new equipment. Only one explanation made sense. Someone new was in command. Patton's approach was simple but terrifyingly effective. He believed hesitation killed more soldiers than boldness. He demanded speed, shock, and constant pressure. His philosophy mirrored German blitzkrieg doctrine, and German commanders recognized it immediately. They were facing an American general who fought the way they did. By July 1943, the Allies launched the invasion of Sicily. The official plan gave Montgomery's British Eighth Army the primary role, advancing up the eastern coast, while Patton's U.S. 7th Army protected the flank. Patton had no intention of remaining in a supporting role. He drove his army across western Sicily at a speed that astonished both allies and enemies. Roads clogged with retreating German units suddenly became escape routes under threat. German commanders attempting an orderly withdrawal found themselves racing against time. What they expected to accomplish in days had to be done in hours. When Patton reached Messina, he arrived before Montgomery. Despite starting farther away, his forces had covered nearly 200 miles in just 39 days while fighting continuously. German after-action reports described the campaign with a mix of professional admiration and genuine fear. One German officer wrote that Patton fought like a panzer commander, not an American infantry general. He took risks American doctrine discouraged. He exploited weaknesses before defenders could react. Most alarming of all, he thought like a German. That was exactly what terrified them. At the height of his success in August 1943, Patton nearly destroyed his own career. During visits to evacuation hospitals in Sicily, he encountered soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. Viewing their condition as cowardice, Patton lost control. He slapped one soldier. A week later, he slapped another and threatened him with a pistol. Word of the incidents reached Eisenhower, who was furious. The story leaked to the press, triggering public outrage. Newspapers demanded Patton's removal. Politicians called for his disgrace. German intelligence followed the controversy closely. They had identified Patton as the most dangerous American general. Now it appeared the Americans might remove him themselves. It seemed too good to be true. But Eisenhower did not fire Patton. He reprimanded him severely and removed him temporarily from combat command. To German commanders, this decision carried an ominous message. The Americans still valued Patton. They were saving him for something important. And somewhere they knew George S. Patton was waiting. By early 1944, George S. Patton had disappeared from the front lines. Officially, he held no combat command. Unofficially, he had become the centerpiece of the most elaborate deception operation in military history. The Germans knew Patton was in England. They knew he was not commanding the forces preparing for the obvious invasion of France. That fact troubled them deeply. To German intelligence, Patton, without a command, made no sense. They had studied Allied leadership carefully. Eisenhower was a coordinator, not a battlefield commander. Montgomery was slow, deliberate, and predictable. Bradley was competent but cautious. Patton, however, was something else entirely. He was aggressive, fast, and ruthless. The Germans believed the Americans would never waste their most dangerous general on a secondary role. So the question haunted German headquarters. What was Patton waiting for? The answer they reached would shape the fate of the war. German intelligence concluded that Patton must be commanding the main invasion force, the decisive blow that would smash into Fortress Europe. This force, they believed, would land at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. It was the shortest crossing, the most logical location, and the place where German defenses were strongest. And that was exactly where the Allies wanted the Germans to look. The 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by Patton, appeared massive. German spies reported bustling headquarters, heavy radio traffic, and armored formations assembling in southeast England. Aerial reconnaissance seemed to confirm the buildup. Tanks sat in fields. Landing craft lined the coast. Everything pointed to Calais. What the Germans did not know was that almost none of it was real. The tanks were inflatable rubber. The buildings were painted plywood. The radio traffic was carefully scripted deception. Patton's army existed almost entirely in German imagination. This deception, Operation Fortitude, worked for one simple reason. The Germans believed in Patton more than they believed in logic. Wherever Patton was, they were certain that was where the real attack would come. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and other senior commanders placed their best armored reserves near Calais. Panzer divisions were held back, waiting for Patton's strike. Coastal defenses there were strengthened, while other sectors received fewer resources. The Germans were confident. They believed they had correctly read Allied intentions. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. At first, German commanders were confused but not panicked. Normandy was far from Calais. It didn't match their expectations. Many believed the landings were a diversion, designed to pull German reserves south before Patton attacked with the main force across the Channel. Rundstedt wanted to release the panzer reserves immediately and crush the beachheads before they could expand. But the order never came. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle believed Normandy was only the opening move. Patton's army, they were sure, was still waiting in England. So the German armored divisions stayed where they were. For 6 critical weeks, the most powerful German formations in the West sat idle near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Those divisions could have destroyed the fragile Allied foothold in Normandy during its most vulnerable phase. Instead, they waited for Patton. By the time German leadership realized the truth, it was too late. On August 1, 1944, George S. Patton finally returned to combat command. He took control of the U.S. Third Army and entered the Normandy battlefield. The Germans had been expecting him for months. Now he was here. What followed confirmed every fear German intelligence had ever had about Patton. Within days, Third Army broke out of Normandy and surged across France at breathtaking speed. Patton's divisions advanced so quickly that German maps became useless. Defensive lines drawn in the morning were irrelevant by evening. German units that believed they were behind the front suddenly found American tanks in their rear. Patton did not pause to consolidate gains. He pushed relentlessly forward, forcing German commanders to react rather than plan. Supply routes were cut. Headquarters were overrun. Communications collapsed. The German command structure in western France began to disintegrate. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced Rundstedt, sent increasingly desperate messages to Berlin. He described a battlefield where the enemy seemed to be everywhere at once. Every attempt to establish a defensive line failed. Patton was already past it. By mid-August, Patton recognized an opportunity that could annihilate German forces in France. Retreating German armies were funneling through a narrow gap near the town of Falaise. If Allied forces could close the gap, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers would be trapped. Patton drove north with ruthless speed. Canadian and Polish forces pushed south. The pocket tightened. Inside the encirclement, chaos erupted. German units panicked. Vehicles were abandoned. Soldiers fled on foot. Officers lost control. The destruction was catastrophic. More than 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Tens of thousands were killed or wounded. The German army in France lost most of its tanks, artillery, and transport. Survivors later described the Falaise pocket as worse than Stalingrad. At least at Stalingrad, they said, there had been time to prepare. Patton gave them no time at all. After France collapsed, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German generals. They asked which Allied commanders they respected and feared. The answers were remarkably consistent. Montgomery was predictable. Bradley was cautious. Patton was terrifying. German generals described him as aggressive, unpredictable, and dangerously fast. One panzer commander said Patton was the only Allied general who truly understood armored warfare. Another said Patton fought the way German generals wished they still could. Patton had become exactly what the Germans feared most, a commander who used their own doctrine against them, and did it better. And the war was not over yet. By late 1944, many German commanders believed the worst was over. France had fallen, Paris was liberated, and Allied armies were advancing toward Germany's borders. The Western Front appeared to have stabilized into a grinding war of attrition. German leaders hoped winter would slow the Allied advance and give them time to regroup. Then, in December, Germany launched one final gamble. On December 16, 1944, German forces smashed through the Ardennes forest in a massive surprise offensive. It was Hitler's last major attempt to change the course of the war in the West. The attack caught Allied commanders completely off guard. American units were overrun. Entire divisions were forced into retreat. Panic spread across the front. Within days, the situation became critical. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded in the town of Bastogne. Supply lines were cut. Ammunition ran low. Weather grounded Allied aircraft, preventing resupply. German commanders believed they had achieved what seemed impossible, splitting the Allied armies in two. Eisenhower immediately called an emergency meeting of senior commanders. The question was simple but terrifying. How quickly could the Allies respond? Most generals spoke cautiously. Moving armies in winter conditions was a logistical nightmare. Roads were icy. Vehicles broke down. Supply lines were strained. Several commanders estimated it would take weeks before a meaningful counterattack could be launched. Then George S. Patton spoke. He said he could attack in 48 hours. The room fell silent. Turning an entire army 90 degrees and launching an offensive on a new axis in 2 days was unheard of. The logistics alone should have taken weeks. Many believed Patton was exaggerating, performing for attention. Eisenhower looked directly at him and asked if he was serious. Patton was not guessing. Unknown to most Allied commanders, Patton's intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had predicted the German offensive weeks earlier. While others dismissed the possibility, Patton had quietly prepared contingency plans. His staff had already mapped routes, fuel requirements, and supply needs for a rapid pivot north. Patton didn't need time to prepare. He was ready. With a single phone call, Patton set his plan in motion. Orders were issued immediately. Third Army began its astonishing pivot north. More than 250,000 soldiers, tens of thousands of vehicles, and vast quantities of supplies began moving across frozen roads in brutal winter conditions. The Germans could hardly believe what was happening. They had expected at least a week before the Allies could respond effectively. Instead, Patton's forces were already attacking their southern flank. The speed of the maneuver stunned German commanders. Reports flooded in describing American columns appearing where no enemy forces were expected. On December 26, 1944, Patton's spearheads reached Bastogne. The siege was broken. The German offensive, meant to shatter Allied unity, lost its momentum. What had begun as a bold gamble collapsed into a costly failure. Once again, Patton's speed had ruined German calculations. After the war, German generals were asked why the Ardennes offensive failed. Many gave the same answer. They had not expected Patton to react so quickly. They believed they had time. They were wrong. This pattern defined Patton's entire wartime career. From North Africa to France, the Germans consistently underestimated how fast he could move. Every time they made that mistake, they paid for it dearly. German military doctrine emphasized speed, aggression, and exploitation, principles at the heart of blitzkrieg. Patton understood these ideas deeply. He believed war was not about perfect planning, but about seizing opportunities before the enemy could respond. Most Allied commanders relied on overwhelming firepower and careful preparation. Patton relied on shock, momentum, and relentless pressure. He attacked when doctrine said to defend. He advanced when logistics officers said to stop. To German commanders, this made him uniquely dangerous. They could predict most Allied generals. They understood their caution. They knew their methods. Patton defied expectations. His actions broke patterns. He forced German commanders to react instead of plan, creating chaos at every level of command. Captured German officers used the same words again and again when describing him. Unpredictable, aggressive, relentless. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt later said Patton was the Allied general he feared most. General Fritz Bayerlein, a veteran panzer commander, remarked that Patton was the only Allied leader who truly thought like a German armored commander. The Germans respected Erwin Rommel for his boldness and unconventional thinking. In Patton, they faced those same qualities, directed against them. Yet Patton's greatest weapon was not just speed or aggression. It was decision-making. Patton made decisions faster than his opponents. While German commanders debated options and waited for approval, Patton acted. Even when his decisions involved risk, the speed of execution often made those risks irrelevant. By the time the enemy reacted, the situation had already changed. As the Allies pushed toward Germany in early 1945, Patton continued to advance with relentless momentum. Rivers were crossed under fire. Towns were taken before defenders could organize. German resistance crumbled as entire units surrendered to avoid being overrun. By the end of the war, the German army that had once conquered Europe lay in ruins. When Allied intelligence officers compiled their post-war assessments, one conclusion stood out clearly. Among all Allied commanders, one name appeared again and again as the most feared by the Germans: George S. Patton. He was feared because he understood their way of war. He was feared because he broke rules and expectations. He was feared because he moved faster than anyone believed possible. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Patton earned that fear through action, not reputation. He forced the German army to confront a commander who fought exactly like they did, only with greater speed, greater aggression, and relentless determination. And that, more than anything else, is why the Germans never stopped watching him and never stopped fearing him. As Allied armies crossed into Germany in early 1945, the war in Europe entered its final and most chaotic phase. The German military was exhausted, outnumbered, and running out of fuel, ammunition, and trained soldiers. Yet pockets of resistance remained fierce, and the danger was far from over. For George S. Patton, this phase of the war offered one final stage to demonstrate the kind of warfare the Germans had feared from the beginning. Patton's Third Army surged eastward with astonishing momentum. While other Allied commanders paused to regroup, secure flanks, and wait for supplies, Patton pushed forward relentlessly. His belief was simple: a beaten enemy must never be given time to recover. Every pause gave the Germans a chance to reorganize, reinforce, or escape. German commanders understood this instinctively and dreaded it. One of Patton's greatest strengths was his ability to exploit collapse. When German resistance weakened in one sector, he did not treat it as a localized success. He treated it as an opportunity to unhinge the entire front. His armored columns bypassed strongpoints, encircled defenders, and drove deep into the enemy rear. German units often discovered they had been outflanked only after their supply lines were cut. This method shattered German command and control. Communications broke down. Orders arrived too late to matter. Commanders on the ground had no clear picture of where the front line was, because Patton kept moving it. Entire divisions surrendered simply because they found themselves isolated, surrounded, and without hope of relief. In March 1945, Patton faced one of the last major natural obstacles between the Allies and the heart of Germany: the Rhine River. German doctrine emphasized defending river lines at all costs. The Rhine, in particular, was considered a final defensive barrier. Many German officers believed any Allied crossing would require weeks of preparation. Patton crossed it almost immediately. When he learned that Allied forces had seized a bridgehead at Remagen, Patton did not wait for elaborate coordination. He ordered his army forward at once. Within days, Third Army units were crossing the Rhine on pontoon bridges, catching German defenders completely unprepared. Patton reportedly remarked that he would make the Rhine crossing look like a hasty river crossing during maneuvers. For the Germans, it felt exactly like that: fast, chaotic, and overwhelming. As Third Army poured into central Germany, resistance collapsed at an accelerating pace. German soldiers surrendered in massive numbers. Entire towns fell without a fight. Patton's advance became less a series of battles and more a rolling disintegration of German military power. Yet, even in victory, Patton remained controversial. He clashed frequently with other Allied commanders, particularly over strategy. Patton wanted to drive straight for Berlin. He believed speed could end the war quickly and decisively. Political considerations, however, dictated otherwise. Berlin was left to the Soviets, and Allied advances were shaped by agreed boundaries rather than battlefield opportunity. Patton was furious. To him, war was about momentum and destruction of the enemy's will. Politics slowed that momentum. German officers later noted that Patton's frustration was understandable. They believed that if Patton had been unleashed without restraint, the war in the West might have ended even sooner. In April 1945, Patton's forces liberated several concentration camps, including Buchenwald. What they found shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. The scale of suffering and cruelty stunned Patton deeply. Though often portrayed as ruthless, he was profoundly affected by the evidence of Nazi crimes. For German prisoners and civilians alike, Patton's arrival often meant the end of organized resistance. Many German officers preferred surrendering to Third Army rather than risking encirclement or destruction. They knew Patton's reputation. If he was approaching, hesitation meant annihilation. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Patton had become a living legend, admired, feared, and controversial in equal measure. After the war, Allied intelligence officers conducted extensive interrogations of captured German generals. The goal was to understand how the enemy had viewed Allied leadership. The results were strikingly consistent. German officers repeatedly emphasized Patton's speed. They emphasized his aggression. But above all, they emphasized his unpredictability. Montgomery, they said, was cautious and methodical. His moves could be anticipated. Bradley was solid and professional, but conservative. His offensives unfolded slowly. Patton, however, was impossible to read. He attacked when others paused. He advanced when others consolidated. German generals explained that this unpredictability destroyed their ability to plan. War depended on anticipation. Against Patton, anticipation failed. One German panzer officer remarked that Patton was the only Allied general who made us feel the way we once made others feel. That statement carried enormous weight. The German army had built its early victories on shock, speed, and confusion. Facing Patton, they experienced those same effects turned against them. Even Patton's flaws contributed to his legend. His temper, his harsh discipline, and his public statements often created political problems. Yet German officers understood something many of his critics did not. Patton's personality was inseparable from his command style. The same intensity that made him difficult also made him effective. Removing it would have dulled his edge. In the end, Patton's greatest achievement was not any single battle or campaign. It was psychological. He forced the German army to confront a commander who spoke their language of war fluently. He understood maneuver warfare, exploitation, and relentless pressure, not as theory, but as instinct. As one German general summarized after the war, Patton was dangerous because he never allowed the enemy time to breathe. And for an army already gasping for survival, that was fatal. Part 5 will conclude Patton's legacy and why history ultimately judged him as one of the most formidable battlefield commanders of World War II. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were shattered, armies destroyed, and millions were dead. For George S. Patton, victory did not bring peace of mind. While the world celebrated the end of the war, Patton remained restless, frustrated, and deeply aware that history would judge him as harshly as it praised him. To the defeated German generals, however, judgment was already clear. In post-war interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence, German commanders were asked a simple question: which Allied general did you fear the most? The answer, repeated again and again, was George S. Patton. Not because he commanded the largest forces, or because he enjoyed the most political influence, but because he represented the kind of warfare the German army understood and dreaded. Patton had defeated them using their own principles. German doctrine emphasized movement, initiative, and relentless exploitation of success. Blitzkrieg was built on the idea that speed and shock could collapse an enemy faster than firepower alone. Patton absorbed these ideas long before the war began. He believed that hesitation was the greatest sin in warfare, and that bold action could compensate for imperfect information. Where other Allied commanders sought certainty, Patton accepted chaos. This mindset shaped every campaign he led. In North Africa, he restored a shattered army through discipline and aggression. In Sicily, he turned a supporting role into a decisive race that nearly trapped German forces. In France, he transformed the Normandy breakout into a sweeping collapse of German defenses. In the Ardennes, he responded to surprise with speed so shocking that it broke the enemy's final offensive. To German officers, this pattern was unmistakable. They did not lose to Patton because he had more men or better equipment. They lost because he consistently moved faster than their decision-making process. While German commanders waited for orders, Patton acted. While they planned, he advanced. By the time they responded, the battlefield had already changed. One captured German general summarized it bluntly: "Patton fought the war we wanted to fight, but could no longer fight." Yet Patton's legacy was not without contradiction. He was a man of intense discipline who sometimes crossed the line into cruelty. He demanded absolute obedience and showed little patience for weakness. His public statements often embarrassed Allied leadership, particularly in the post-war occupation of Germany. He spoke bluntly, sometimes recklessly, and refused to adapt his personality to political realities. These flaws cost him dearly. Patton was relieved of his command of Third Army after the war and reassigned to administrative duties. To a man who lived for combat leadership, this was a crushing blow. He felt sidelined, misunderstood, and unappreciated. The general who had terrorized the German army now struggled to find purpose in peacetime. Tragically, Patton's life ended only months after the war. In December 1945, he was severely injured in an automobile accident in Germany and died shortly afterward. The man who had survived countless battles was gone, leaving behind a legacy still fiercely debated. But among professional soldiers, especially those who had faced him, there was little debate. German generals spoke of Patton with a mixture of respect and awe. They understood his flaws, but they also recognized his genius. They knew how rare it was to find a commander who could sense opportunity, seize it instantly, and exploit it without hesitation. Patton did not merely win battles. He collapsed systems. He shattered command structures. He turned retreats into disasters. This was why German intelligence had obsessed over him from the beginning. This was why they believed the main invasion would come wherever Patton was. This was why they froze their panzer reserves at Calais while Normandy burned. This was why they underestimated his response at the Ardennes and paid the price. In the end, Patton's greatest weapon was psychological. He created uncertainty. German commanders never knew where he would strike next or how far he would go. That uncertainty paralyzed decision-making. In war, hesitation is deadly, and Patton forced hesitation upon his enemies again and again. Historians often debate whether Patton could have gone further, whether he could have driven to Berlin, or whether his aggressive style would eventually have led to disaster. These questions can never be answered definitively. What can be said with certainty is that Patton changed the way the German army fought by forcing it into constant reaction. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, summarized Patton's impact with remarkable clarity after the war. Of all the Allied generals he faced, Patton was the most dangerous, not because he was reckless, but because he was relentless, not because he ignored doctrine, but because he understood when to break it. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of the Ardennes, Georges, Patton imposed his will on the battlefield. He fought with speed, violence, and unyielding pressure. He denied his enemies time, space, and confidence, the three things an army needs to survive. That is why German generals feared him more than any other Allied commander. They were not afraid of his words or his reputation. They were afraid of how fast he moved. They were afraid of how decisively he acted. They were afraid because he fought like them, only better. And in war, there is no fear greater than facing an enemy who understands you completely.